The Canterbury Tales, The Reeves Tale, A Racket at the Mill. There once was a crook of a miller called Matthew. He owned the only mill for miles around, so that he could rob his customers daily, and still they had to bring their corn to him for grinding. But there were two students, Bright and Spark, living locally. They decided that they had brains enough between them to outwit the old scoundrel and pay him back for some of his double dealing. How could they know that a miller's not just as greedy as a hole in the ground, but as slippery as a handful of butter as well? Bright and Spark brought their own corn to the mill on horseback and set it down, 2 big sacks filled to bursting by the millstone. Then they sat down on the floor. "That's all right, boys," said Matthew. "No need to hang around. I'll call you when it's ready." "We'll stay, thank you," they replied, and fixed their eyes on the miller as if to say, "Now steal 1 grain, if you can." If Matthew was vexed, it did not show. He set about his work, whistling tunelessly. "Oh, look at that now," he interrupted himself. "I've started work without an apron." And he slipped downstairs on the excuse of fetching one. Untying the reins of 2 horses at the hitching rail, he gave their rumps such a thwack that it did not stop running until they were 5 fields away. Then Matthew returned to his mill room and observed nonchalantly to Bright and Spark, "Surely you didn't come on foot with such heavy load?" "No," they said, "on horseback." Well, where did you get to put them? I saw no horses in the yard." It took them all afternoon to catch their animals, and by the time they crawled back to the mill, Matthew had finished grinding their corn and stood at the door, his thumbs tucked into the armholes of his smock. At his feet lay a saggy, half-empty sack. "How tedious for you, boys. I wonder how they got loose. Still, here's your flour, and finer ground than you'd get from any mill in the south of England." "But we bought 2 big sacks of corn," Spark protested despairingly. "Ah, well, lots of husk, you know. An awful lot of husk on the breed of corn." Bright glared murderously at the miller, but what could he say? A miller would lay his hand on a Bible and swear a cow had 5 legs. So Bright and Spark took their miserable scraping of flour and laughed. They did not go far. From the end of the lane, they doubled back and hid in the miller's barn till nightfall. While clouds smothered the moon, they crept into the house and up to the miller's bedroom. A new baby was snuffing and scratching in the crib at the foot of one bed, the bed of the miller's wife, of course. In the other, Matthew lay tangled in blankets like a pig in a parcel, snoring. In bare feet, Spark and Bright crept to the cot and lifted it across the room to the foot of the miller's bed. Then they paddled back to the door and coughed and rattled the latch and said, "Burgle, burgle, burgle," in low voices. Matthew only turned over in his sleep and sucked his thumb. But his wife's eyes opened as wide as sunflowers, and she kicked off the blankets. She was a huge woman, and when she lifted the distaff that stood against the wall, she was as huge and white as a ship's foresail with the bowsprit in front. Through the house she crept in search of the burglars, but Bright and Spark were giggling together in the press, and she found no one. Only when she returned to the bedroom did she see the crib at the foot of the bed and a shape in the bed. She raised such a hullabaloo that the mill race froze in terror. "Hide in my bed, would you, you villain? Hide in my own bed? There, take that for your impudence, and that for your villainy, and that for your burglary." As Bright and Spark crept down the stairs, the miller's whimpers were rising to a roar, punctuated by the blows from the distaff and the wife's furious shrieks. "And that for the shame you've brought on your poor mother, and that—" They left hastily, but not so hastily as to leave behind 2 fat sacks of flour from the miller's own larder. I hope I told that correctly. I admit, I had some trouble hearing the Reeves story. This might have something to do with the miller playing his bagpipes all the way through it. As Oswald finished the story, he rode with dignity up to Matt and asked if he could borrow the bagpipes. "Just for a moment, my dear friend." Matt handled them over warily, knowing Oswald would never dare to hit him with them. We were just then crossing the river. As Oswald trotted over the bridge, he tossed the pipes lightly over the wall. They sank with a splash and then bobbled to the surface again and sailed downstream as stately as a Viking funeral ship. "They put me in mind," said the sea captain sentimentally, "of a privateer schooner I once sank in the Skagerrak." The parson went and retrieved them. When the 100 of who came into sight, we had lunch at an inn. Since the incident with the bagpipes, several of us have been asking the sea captain for a story. We relished the idea of a sailor's yarn, of pirates and sharks and the like. He told us a long story about a careful merchant and his wife who overspent in the housekeeping. There was not one drop of the sea in it. The merchant said it was wonderful, a great contribution to the body of English literature. Personally, I would have preferred a pirate story. The troop of horses straggled out, single file, picking their way among deep boggy carts' ruts, then forked left at a signpost. We just looked around in time to see one poor, thin bee shambling off on the other road. Its rider, the scholar from Oxford, had his head in a book and was quite unaware of losing us. Harry Bailey shook his head. "He'd be in Maidstone before he'd even noticed," he said, then galloped off to haul the schooner's pony back into line. "Now come on, lad. Set your studies to one side. There's a time and a place for everything, and this is the time and here's the place for your story. Don't say you don't know any the way you read. You must have seen every word a pen ever wrote." The scholar looked around at us, as vague as a man just woken from a deep sleep. "Look at that. Bless him," said the widow in the hat. "I don't suppose he's remembered to wash his neck or eat a bite of food since he opened that book. What's so good about it, love? You can't put it down. It's naughty. Ha, ha, ha." The scholar blushed and he held up the book. "It's the Mathematical Astronomy." He blinked like an owl at us until Harry reminded him about the competition. Then he said, "Well, if you care for a contribution for someone too inarticulate and lacking in proficient handling of the dramatic forms fundamental to the narrative tradition—" "Is he talking Latin?" said the yeoman. "No," said Hubert, "but I'll be damned if it's like the English my mother taught me." The scholar blushed again and went back to his book. "Tell us a story, boy, and keep your long words for impressing your pupils," said Harry, clapping on the scholar on the back. His thin shank's pony buckled at the knees. Obviously, the lad spent his money on books before clothes for him or hay for his horse. "I went to Italy last year," he said slowly, as if he was picking the easiest words he knew. "And as I read the story while I was there, would you like to hear that one?" A cheer went up from the troop of riders. "What did he say?" asked the widow in the hat.